The question being asked across political circles this week is whether the newest leader has managed to expose fundamental flaws in an approach that relies almost entirely on threats rather than negotiation. What happened at the World Economic Forum in Davos, followed by the response from Washington, reveals something important about how power actually functions between nations when the traditional rules no longer seem to apply. The sequence of events matters here. The Canadian leader delivered a speech at Davos that never mentioned the American administration by name, yet every person in that room understood exactly what was being addressed. The speech talked about great powers using economic integration as weapons, about tariffs being deployed as leverage, about supply chains being treated as vulnerabilities to exploit. The message was clear without being explicit. Middle powers, according to this argument, must band together because if they are not at the table, they are on the menu. The response from the room was a standing ovation, which is unusual at these forums. The response from Washington came the next day. The American leader said that his counterpart was not grateful, that his country lives because of the relationship with the superpower to its south. He used the term governor instead of prime minister, continuing a pattern of suggesting that sovereignty itself is conditional. Then came the threat. If a deal is made with another major power, specifically regarding electric vehicles and agricultural products, a 100% tariff would be imposed on all goods crossing the border. This is the threat we need to examine closely because it exposes the actual mechanics of the strategy being employed. Start with the timeline. The deal being referenced was announced just days before the Davos speech. Under this agreement, roughly 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles would be allowed into the market annually at a tariff rate just above 6%, down from 100%. In exchange, tariffs on agricultural exports like canola seed would drop from 84% to 15%. The volume represents less than 3% of the annual vehicle market. The agreement includes provisions for potential Chinese investment in domestic manufacturing. The American leader had actually commented on this deal when it was first announced, saying it was a good thing that getting deals with major powers is what leaders should do. So what changed between that initial response and the threat of total tariffs? The Davos speech happened. The speech that suggested the old order is not returning, that nostalgia is not strategy, that coercion by great powers on smaller nations cannot be the basis for stable international relations. The speech that received global attention and was praised by former leaders from Australia to Europe. The speech that, according to multiple reports, clearly upset the American administration because it shifted attention and framed the current moment in terms of bullying rather than strength. This tells us that the threat is not actually about the substance of the trade agreement. The electric vehicle deal does not violate any existing trade framework. The agreement between the three North American nations, which replaced the previous free trade arrangement, does not prevent bilateral deals. It contains a clause requiring notification if a member pursues a free trade agreement with what it terms a non-market economy. But notification is not prohibition. The deal announced involves tariff adjustments and quotas, not a comprehensive free trade agreement. The response from the Northern government was immediate and precise on this point. There is no intention to pursue a free trade agreement. The obligations under the Continental Trade Framework will be respected. The threat of 100% tariffs is therefore not based on any actual violation. It is based on the perception of insufficient deference. This is what makes the strategy fundamentally weak rather than strong. Real economic leverage is exercised through mechanisms that align interests and create mutual dependencies that make cooperation more valuable than conflict. What we are seeing instead is the substitution of rhetoric for strategy, where the goal appears to be dominance signaling rather than achieving optimal economic outcomes. Consider the practical implications of actually implementing a 100% tariff on all goods from the northern neighbor. We are talking about roughly $3.6 billion in trade crossing the border every day. 60% of crude oil imports come from this source. 85% of electricity imports. It is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium, 34 critical minerals that are priorities for national security, the top export destination for 36 states. The supply chains are not merely connected. They are integrated to the point where separation would cause immediate disruption to manufacturing across multiple sectors. The threat assumes that this damage would be asymmetric, that the pain would be felt more acutely on one side than the other. But modern trade relationships do not work this way, particularly between economies as intertwined as these two. When tariffs are imposed on imported steel, the cost is not absorbed by the foreign producer. It is passed to the domestic manufacturer who needs that steel for production. When tariffs are placed on energy imports, the impact shows up in electricity costs and fuel prices for consumers. The threatened action would function as a massive tax on the American economy, imposed at a time when inflation concerns remain elevated. This is why the threat lacks credibility among analysts who focus on actual economic outcomes rather than political theater. The retaliation would be immediate. Tariffs would be matched. Energy exports could face restrictions. Critical minerals could be redirected to other markets. The damage to both economies would be substantial, but the political cost would fall on whoever is seen as having initiated an unnecessary crisis over a relatively minor trade adjustment that benefits agricultural producers on both sides of the border. What the speech at Davos accomplished was reframing the conversation. Instead of accepting the premise that smaller economies must simply accommodate whatever demands are made, regardless of their own interests, the argument was made that there is an alternative. Middle powers can coordinate. They can diversify their trade relationships. They can make clear that bullying has costs, that transactional relationships require both sides to gain something of value, that threats without follow-through eventually lose their power to coerce. The response to this argument was not substantive engagement. It was an escalation of threats accompanied by personal insults. The nickname governor was repeated. The suggestion that sovereignty is conditional was reinforced. The threat of catastrophic tariffs was issued, but none of this addresses the fundamental problem, which is that the strategy being employed assumes infinite tolerance for disruption and no ability for other nations to find alternative arrangements. The electric vehicle deal with the other major power is instructive here. It happened because the previous alignment where policies were coordinated to exclude certain imports stopped serving the interests of the northern economy. Agricultural producers were losing billions in market access. The supposed benefit of keeping out less expensive vehicles was not materializing in terms of domestic production. The calculation changed. The decision was made to adjust policy based on national economic interest rather than maintaining symbolic alignment. This is exactly what the Davos speech was describing. The old order, where smaller economies would absorb costs to maintain the preferences of the dominant power, is breaking down because those costs have become too high and the benefits too uncertain. The rupture, as it was termed in the speech, is not something being imposed from outside. It is the natural consequence of a strategy that treats relationships as zero-sum competitions where one side must always yield. The threat of 100% tariffs is meant to prevent this kind of independent decision-making. It is meant to signal that there is no option except compliance. But this is where the strategy reveals its weakness. Threats only work if they are credible and if the target has no alternatives. Neither condition applies here. The economic damage from following through would be mutual and severe. The alternatives, in terms of diversifying trade relationships and building coalitions with other middle powers, are becoming more attractive precisely because the threats keep escalating. What the leader who gave the Davos speech understands, and what the response from Washington seems to miss, is that leverage in international relations is not about who can threaten the most dramatic action. It is about who has more options, who can better absorb disruption, and who can build coalitions that multiply their effective power. The speech was not a declaration of independence from the relationship with the southern neighbor. It was a clear statement that the relationship must be based on mutual respect and shared interests, not on subordination enforced through economic coercion. The strategic error being made is assuming that because the northern economy is smaller, it has no choice but to accept whatever terms are offered. This might have been true in an earlier era when global trade was less diversified and when there were fewer alternative partners. But the current reality is different. The other major powers are actively seeking to expand their influence and are willing to offer concrete benefits to nations that are reconsidering their exclusive alignments. The speech at Davos was noticed not just because of its bold rhetoric, but because it articulated what many middle power nations are already thinking. The 100% tariff threat will not be implemented. It cannot be implemented without causing immediate political problems through price increases and supply disruptions. The threat exists in the realm of rhetoric, where it is meant to intimidate and to punish the perceived lack of deference shown in that speech. But rhetoric that is not backed by credible action eventually loses its effectiveness. Each time a dramatic threat is made and then either not followed through or quickly reversed, the next threat carries less weight. What we are watching is a fundamental mismatch between the tools being used and the actual challenges being faced. The global economy has become too complex and too integrated for simple tariff threats to reshape trade relationships in the way that might have worked decades ago. The attempt to use threats of economic pain as the primary tool of foreign policy assumes that other nations have no agency, no alternatives, and no ability to withstand pressure. The Davos speech and the response to it demonstrate that these assumptions are incorrect. The deal that triggered the latest threats involves less than 3% of the northern vehicle market and provides substantial benefits to agricultural producers. It is a modest adjustment, not a fundamental realignment. The reaction has been to threaten total economic warfare. This disproportion between action and response reveals that the real issue is not economics at all. It is about maintaining a hierarchical relationship where decisions must be approved, where independence is treated as betrayal, and where alternative partnerships are seen as unacceptable challenges to authority. The problem with this approach is that it forces other nations to choose between their own economic interests and maintaining the appearance of subordination. When that choice becomes too stark, when the costs of maintaining the traditional relationship outweigh the benefits, the decision becomes straightforward. The speech at Davos was significant because it made this choice explicit. It said that middle powers can work together, that they can pursue their own interests, that they can withstand pressure if they coordinate their responses. The threat of 100% tariffs is the response of a strategy that has run out of other options. It cannot offer better terms. It cannot provide more attractive alternatives. It can only threaten greater punishment. But punishment only works as a tool if the target believes there is a path back to normal relations through compliance. If compliance means accepting subordination indefinitely, if it means abandoning your own economic interests permanently, then the incentive structure breaks down. It becomes more rational to accept the punishment and build alternative relationships than to remain in a one-sided arrangement. This is the strategic failure that the speech exposed. The current approach assumes that power differentials alone determine outcomes, that smaller economies will always choose the path of least resistance, that threats will always be sufficient to maintain alignment. But power is not just about size or military capability. It is about options, about resilience, about the ability to form coalitions that change the effective balance. The northern nation demonstrated in Davos that it understands this. The response from Washington suggests that this understanding has not been reciprocated. The 100% tariff threat will fade like the previous threats. There will be negotiations, there will be adjustments, and the fundamental relationship will continue because it serves important interests on both sides. But the terms of that relationship are changing. The speech at Davos and the international response to it demonstrate that the era where the dominant power could simply dictate terms through threats is ending. What comes next will depend on whether there is recognition that mutual benefit requires mutual respect, or whether the pattern of escalating threats and inevitable retreats will continue until the relationship itself becomes the problem it was meant to solve. The reality is that threats work until they do not. Leverage exists until alternatives emerge. Dominance lasts until the costs of maintaining it exceed the benefits. The Davos speech was notable not because it said anything particularly radical, but because it said clearly what many nations have been thinking quietly. The response, with its threats of catastrophic tariffs that will not actually be imposed, reveals a strategy that has mistaken the appearance of strength for actual strength, and that confusion may prove to be its greatest weakness.